In the house. Are you? You're supposed to stand up. Okay. And whoever was looking for you hopefully found you. And if not, oh well. Just a couple of announcements. T-shirts are still on sale, well, they're not on sale. You're donating for them, and then you can get a T-shirt. So check out the registration desk. We don't want to haul them back. It's no fun. A couple of other announcements. If you need your parking validation or anything like that, that's also a registration. And now I have mistimed, so I don't know how ready the streaming team is. Hey, they look ready. So hopefully no one is late to the talk, because that would be wildly unfortunate. And now I have my notes. So our next speaker is Xeno Kovah, and he's going to be talking about betting BIOS bugs won't bite your butt. That's a question. So here he is.
Test. All right, hello everyone. My colleague Corey couldn't be here today, so let's just get started. So first I'm just going to give a little bit of context so you understand where this presentation is coming from. For the last 7.5 years or so, Corey and I and some other researchers were working at the MITRE Corporation on sort of low-level security, published a whole bunch of papers about different types of attacks down at the lowest levels. Conveniently enough, yesterday was my last day at MITRE, so today I'm full-time at LegbaCore. And I cannot express to you how great it feels to have a public release chain of exactly one other person. I have to say, Corey, can we talk about this? And he says, yeah, okay, that's good. So this is going to be, more fun than some of my past talks. Well, for me, not necessarily for you. So what are we doing at LegbaCore? We're doing all the same stuff that we've been doing. So if you're familiar with our work, you'll understand that. If you're not, you'll see some of it expressed here today. So we're just looking at all the stuff down in the deep, dark parts of the system that nobody else tends to look at, and therefore, gives attackers free passes. And just to explain where the Legba and LegbaCore comes from, Papa Legba is the voodoo spirit who's essentially the gatekeeper, the access control mechanism between the spirit world and the human world. And there's a very strong thread of access control bypass in our work. So we thought that Papa Legba would be a very good patron for us going forward. So this is really an awareness talk. We really love the super deep, nitty-gritty technical talks, but this is, occasionally we have to bring it up a level and just provide some awareness to explain to people what's going on. So the point of this talk is I don't assume that you've been looking at this type of work for the last couple of years. There's a whole lot of areas for people to keep track of, but I thought that there's really been a lot of stuff going on in the past couple of years in terms of BIOS insecurity, vulnerabilities and attacks down at the lowest level, and I thought that people needed to get at least a little bit of a survey talk about that. And of course I wanted to talk about what you can actually do about the variety of problems that we're going to be speaking about. So unfortunately today, firmware security, BIOS security, it's really not on most people's radar. It's just completely off the map, not something you think about. And that's kind of a problem because things like the BIOS, they are the most privileged code on the system. They are the thing that can compromise every other thing. Your hypervisors, your operating systems, your applications. Everything is compromised when the BIOS is compromised, right? So if someone can run first, they can modify everything else. And the other thing is, it's not just a matter of, okay, they can mess with all of your code that's running, but sort of on demand, on command, at their whim, they can turn off your systems in a way that they're not going to be coming back on for quite a long time. So the problem is, right, if the very first instruction on your CPU is coming from this BIOS flash chip, and if that's an invalid instruction, there is no error handler at the first instruction. If the first instruction is bad, your system, your CPU will never ever start up, and no amount of booting off of boot CDs, USBs, swapping out hard drives, nothing's going to bring you back up from that sort of thing, right? Unless you run around with flash chip programmers and attach them to your motherboards. So it's kind of a problem that we have these sort of vulnerabilities that can kind of compromise everything and take down your systems on demand. There's sort of a persistent myth pertaining to BIOS level attacks that you need physical presence, you need to somehow attach to the machine in order to compromise it, be physically at the system. And we've showed, and other people have showed through a lot of work, that that's just simply not the case. So just get that myth out of your mind right now. And maybe you know of things like BIOS passwords. Maybe you happen to be living in a world that is relatively locked down, and you have BIOS passwords. They restrict you from booting off of a CD, things like that. It's important to understand for the context of the discussion today, BIOS passwords do not protect your BIOS. They protect a little bit of the settings that a human at the box can get to, but as I already said, we don't need to be at the box. We're just talking about breaking into the BIOS from lower levels, from other levels. And another myth I just wanted to dispel is that, people say, well, back when I was thinking about BIOSes 20 years ago, we had these little security mechanism called physical jumpers, and you couldn't actually write to the BIOS unless someone went and flipped a switch or moved a jumper. And that's just simply doesn't exist anymore as far as we're concerned for enterprise-grade things. Yes, maybe you have your own personal motherboard, your own personal thing you put together, and there's BIOS modder communities and overclocking and all that. Enterprise-grade systems, we've never ever seen a single enterprise-grade system that has a physical jumper that actually protects against writes to your BIOS. Because basically, they know that they have lots of bugs, the BIOSes are getting very big and complicated, and they need ways to update and patch them. So physical jumpers would be too big of a stretch. So just want to speak a little bit about the threats. Unfortunately, I'm going to dwell here more than I want to, but threats, the first sort of crimeware level threat, this was some malware that was found in China. It wasn't, Chinese APT type stuff. It was just some malware that was circulating. Someone weaponized a proof of concept from 2007. It infects, one particular BIOS, and all they did with it was they just said, okay, I have a normal bootkit. The bootkit infects the master boot record, and I'm just going to pull that back into the BIOS so that even if you swap out the hard drive, even if you clean the hard drive, the BIOS will always be slapping down that bootkit onto the master boot record. So that was a pretty easy, simple kind of thing. Now, the interesting things start kind of from 2013, where the defensive side of NSA basically said, we have seen other states in the wild looking to compromise BIOS, right? So if you're the type of people that believe what the defensive side of the NSA says, then that should be something that you kind of care about, right? They're saying that we see other people specifically targeting down at this level. And so, that was good for us because we work on sort of completely unclassified from all of the related work that's out there in the conferences, and so we now have something we can point to and say, aha, the NSA says people are going out to attack BIOSes. Then the story got a little more complicated when that same month there was later on a talk at CCC that was specifically about how the offensive side of NSA actually already attacks down at the BIOS level. Right? So that's kind of, the elephant in the room here. And you'd think that, from some perspective, that's good news for us because no one can ever come to us again and say, oh, we don't really think this is realistic. We don't think people can actually attack down at the BIOS level. You can say, well, the US already is, right? So that's, a good thing from us, but I think, on net balance, it's a very bad thing for us and everyone else in the world. Because when that sort of capability is revealed, what you get is a situation where every Tom, Dick, and Harry from every other country in the world who maybe they thought it wasn't possible, maybe they thought it was too much work, they can go to their bosses with offensive catalog in hand and say, dear boss, I can build you these capabilities. We can be just as strong as the NSA. I just need a little plus up in money, please. So I kind of see that situation probably playing out around the world right now, and we're now in a world where it's not just NSA or other people who have these capabilities. There's probably a lot of development going on around the world in order to get attacks at this level, and the problem is the defense is not at all keeping pace with the attacks. We've put out a lot of work on defense over the years, but it's again it's not on their radar for the most part, so don't know what you need to defend against. And then I'm kind of loath to cite this one because they didn't really actually provide any proof, but just to put it out there, in an interview that CrowdStrike did basically as a press release, they said that they had found some Russian state actor attributed malware which was actually collecting the BIOS version information. And so that's either, maybe they have the capability to infect at the BIOS level and CrowdStrike never saw it come down. Maybe they have put it down to the BIOS level and they just don't have the visibility to see it. Or maybe it's just some aspirational capability laying the groundwork to, okay, well, let's go see what all of the BIOSes are on everything that we've infected, and later on we'll come along and infect what we know we can. So I'd started to try to, speaking of the threats and speaking to the awareness that's increasing sort of in the community. I made a graph like this. I have a nice citable thing. You can go, I have a big timeline of like, here's all of the different low-level attacks. And for this graph, it's a little different from some graphs I've presented in the past. I tried to take out all the virtualization things and bootkit things and stuff like that. Just focus on the stuff that I kind of think is the most relevant for this. And it's BIOS level attacks, and it's increasing a little bit. 2009 is kind of the year that we first got very interested in this topic. It was 2008, 2009. Invisible Things Lab was putting out a whole lot of interesting information in this area. But 2009 was basically the first ever BIOS exploit. Defeated all of the protection mechanisms. It assumed the BIOS was locked. It assumed there was digital signature checking on all BIOS updates, so you couldn't just get in easy that way. And it was sort of, the best possible attack from an attacker's perspective, the best possible way to break in. But the irony here is that we were seeing that, and at the time we were thinking, wow, that's just the coolest thing since sliced bread. Well, the leaked NSA offensive capabilities document says that they already had weaponized stuff back in 2008, right? So the community was getting interested in this kind of stuff, but it was already in play out there in the wild, and no one has actually ever found BIOS malware in the wild, right? We've obviously been looking, and we'd like to get more data to try to find something, but no one's ever found it. AV is not even looking at that level. And then it's also just interesting, in these last couple years, there's sort of been an increase in a spike in activity, and partially this last year, a lot of it is just people going out there and saying, hey, look, I can do all the same stuff the NSA can do. And I think there's a talk on that tomorrow, right? There's another NSA playset talk. But I made this picture and I said, okay, well, this doesn't really tell the full story because I know there's been like a whole lot of stuff that's actually been going on. So this is the number of talks that there have been at conferences. But if you like drill down into the actual talks and you say how many unique types of attacks and how many unique malware techniques are they actually talking about, this is sort of the situation. And we've got, like 50%, more than 50%, more than 100% more than 2010, which was the time that we thought was the most interesting time, but right now there's just a massive spike in stuff. So cumulatively, this graph shows sort of 99 different problems that you probably didn't know that you have. And basically, we already know that for 2015, there's already at least 4 talks in the queue, and I don't know exactly how many vulnerabilities there are. So what I wanted to do with this talk was, give a sort of survey talk of, here's the top 10 coolest BIOS attacks that we've seen over the past couple of years. Unfortunately, due to my long-windedness, we're only going to be able to get into 5. But I wrote out everything for the rest of them, and it's in the backup slide, so you can go read that later. So this is going to be our sort of key or legend. It's ambiguous terminology. So when I have this on the bottom of the subsequent slides, if there's an X there, that means the attacker with this particular attack is not able to defeat or compromise this mechanism. And if I have a check there, that means they are able to defeat it. So a check mark means, yes, I can successfully brick, but no, I cannot break into the SBI. So SBI in this chart means the SBI flash chip, the serial peripheral interface flash chip. That's where the BIOS is stored, soldered to the motherboard typically. And that's where the BIOS code lives. That's where basically the very first instruction the CPU ever gets, it reads it off of that flash chip. It pretends like it's going out to memory. The memory hardware is redirecting it down to the flash chip. So if you get into SBI flash, you have the opportunity to run as literally the first instruction that the CPU ever executes. So that basically grants you every other permission. If you can run there, you can break the machine, you can break into SMM, and break everything else. So breaking is kind of like what it sounds like. It just means that you can corrupt the system in such a way that normal recovery mechanisms are completely inapplicable. System management mode, SMM. So there's this notion of if I break into the BIOS, I can compromise everything afterwards. There's 2 ways you might do that. You might do the typical bootkit thing and bounce your way down, infecting each thing on demand as it gets loaded up into memory, but before it has an opportunity to run. The alternative is system management mode, which is basically this persistent code that runs sort of in the background on demand as the system management interrupts fire. And so we showed a lot of interesting work with what a SMM backdoor might look like, and just to say this allows you to compromise a variety of these other levels. Sort of running in the background and can compromise stuff on demand. Secure boot, that's just UEFI or Windows 8 secure boot, so you break that, then you can do all your typical bootkit things. TPM boot, like secure boot, but you're actually taking some measurements, putting in the TPM, and trying to have something you can actually report in a trustworthy way. Authenticated variables are interesting because UEFI, they moved away from CMOS, which was the old limited configuration information. Nowadays, there's these notion of authenticated variables, which are, you can think of them like environment variables that are stored on the flash chip, but specifically the authenticated ones, it's supposed to be that no one but Dell is allowed to update them, or no one but HP is allowed to update them. And they contain, the very important information like keys used for secure boot. So, I gotta jump through the rest of this. Let me go with these three. These three wise men right here are 3 different access control bits or collections of bits that we care about. And basically, these are supposed to be set in a certain way in order to protect the SPI. So it's basically a situation where if you can break these 3, you can break into SPI. If you can break into SPI, you can break everything else. But we'll get into sort of interesting combinations. And again, as it says there, just go reread this later. Just think, more checks, bad. More X's, good. They weren't able to compromise as much. So the first talk we want to talk about is defeating signed BIOS enforcement in 2013. The rest of these are 2014 talks, but this is the only 2013 one. And this was interesting because basically it was the second ever public BIOS exploit. So basically, back in 2009, they compromised the BIOS and they defeated all the digital signature checks. This was the second one like that, and basically what happened is you feed the BIOS a false BIOS update. And when it reads it, it has a buffer overflow. Buffer overflow gets your arbitrary code execution, and consequently, you are now running in SMM before any locks are set, and you can just write directly to the flash chip and compromise everything else. So Corey found this on a Dell Latitude E6400, and there's always obviously going to be code reuse, so that means one single bug there affected 22 different models, and that'll be sort of a recurring thing. Thunderstrike was already mentioned today, and Slashdot ignorance to the contrary. This is not the first bootkit for Mac OS. This was an improvement over existing work, and that's how the author says it. So the existing work was interesting because he said, when you have one of these little dongles, like these, right? So you have like Ethernet adapters and stuff like that for Mac, and they're actually PCI devices, and they have a little bit of code embedded in them. So if they're plugged in when you're booting your system, your BIOS is running around, pulling in the code, executing it. That code can then compromise your operating system because it's running before the operating system. So Thunderstrike basically improved upon this and made some very good points that I think are important. So the first thing was that he found out that these option ROM code runs in the background, and it's a big design flaw that hopefully Apple is fixing right now, that basically even if you're rebooting the system to do a BIOS update, basically you're just doing a normal BIOS update, you're rebooting the system, if that thing's plugged in at the time, that code off of that dongle is going to be executed, and it can therefore do whatever it wants. And you're rebooting the system to do an update, that means the system must be unlocked and expecting to be able to write to the flash chip. So basically the original work by Snare in 2012, that work, it was able to compromise the operating system, but it wasn't really able to compromise the flash chip or the BIOS or all that other early stuff. And what Trammell's work did was he proved categorically that you can break into the flash chip on the Macs and you can compromise everything. And another important point was that it was hypothesized back in 2012 that, well, Snare said, I tried to write to the flash chip, I wasn't able to, it bricked my machine, maybe there's some other protection. There is not another protection. They're still just sort of wide open, and he was able to compromise them. So Speed Racer was another interesting thing, co-discovered by 2 of my team members who were not talking to me or talking to each other. So basically, they independently discovered that there was a hardware race condition. And then, we talked to Rafal from Bromium, and he had similar thoughts. And then Corey went out, implemented this, showed it was absolutely true. And what this race condition means is that basically the hardware has a bug in it where this BIOS lock enable bit that is supposed to be one of the 3 bits that are protecting the BIOS, it just doesn't work. It can always be reliably bypassed. This is a race condition that we can always win. And so now 2 out of the 3 things are still there, but one of them just straight up goes away. And when we did an analysis on some of our existing data that we had, we saw that an enterprise that had been doing patching and stuff like that went from being 30% vulnerable, 30% unlocked SPI, to being 80% vulnerable. So this thing just opened up a giant new gaping hole in a lot of enterprises. At Black Hat earlier this year, Corey disclosed the 3rd and 4th ever public BIOS exploits. And these are extremely widespread. I'll speak to that in a second. But they're also very interesting because you don't need kernel privileges. With the previous one, the 2nd ever one, you needed kernel on Windows. You didn't need it on Linux. But this one, Windows and Linux, they're both great. You can launch it as a privileged user in user space. How these vulnerabilities were found is that there is an open source reference implementation for BIOSes out there. Basically, skeleton code that says, here's how you put together a UEFI BIOS. That code then trickles down to the BIOS vendors, the Phoenix, the AMI, which then trickles down to the Dells and the HPs. And so what basically happened is Corey took a couple weeks, looked at the open source code, did an audit, the same kind of thing that plenty of other attackers can be doing right now. Looked at the code, found some bugs, found exploits, disclosed them, and then through the process of working this out, found that there were over 500 models of HP vulnerable, and Dell and Lenovo only ever told us about their enterprise-grade models, but at least 39 Dells and 45 enterprise Lenovos, and most of the vendors we'll never ever know unless we care enough to really go dig into it, but a lot of the vendors you can pretty much assume they're all vulnerable. All right, last one then, the Darth Venomous attack discovered by Rafal. And basically, when you boot your system, when you reboot your system, it's supposed to become unlocked, right? If you reboot your system, you lose power, these bits get unset, and so that's expected that it's supposed to become unlocked. But what we had found was that actually when you put it into a low power mode, so if I close the lid on my laptop right now, that's called an S3 sleep. So I just put it to sleep, and it turns out when it goes low power like that, a bunch of these bits actually get cleared as well. And so when you wake up, it's the job of the resume handler to lock them again, but some things don't lock them. And we had found a previous vulnerability like that where some models of Dell were not locking it on resume. And we told that to Rafal, and he said, hey, there's this sort of script capability where basically when you resume, there's this little script that gets executed in order to quickly lock down everything and do all the stuff necessary for configuration. And it turns out that if you can compromise the script, and you can compromise the script because they're designed poorly, then you get code execution in the context of this early resume where the BIOS is still unlocked, and basically you can just straight up break into SMM at runtime, you can break into the SPI flash chip, and it's again very devastating. So don't really have time for this, so I'm just going to say, in a days where advanced attackers mean people who can run internal Windows tools, I want to give shout outs to Corey for being an actual advanced attacker. So, and coming up soon, well, don't even time, because I want to talk about defense. So, what can you do today to actually start defending against these kind of things, right? Please, 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 go apply patches, okay? They're free, it's easy. You don't have to boot into DOS or anything from a floppy disk. It's an exe you can run. So if you can push updates for Adobe Acrobat or Adobe Reader, whatever, if you can push updates for Adobe, you can push updates for your BIOSes, right? And basically, we've been doing all these disclosures. We've been, going out there, getting the BIOS vendors to put time and money into actually getting patches made. But every time that you're not patching your things, you're basically putting in a vote that says, yeah, I would like attackers to still be able to, keep moving around down at this level without being caught. So the other things are Copernicus, previous project that I was leading at MITRE. Still like it, still want you to go use it. Copernicus is basically a Windows kernel driver that will give you the ability to vulnerability check and integrity check your BIOSes. So it'll dump out all the configuration bits and it'll just tell you 0 or 1, are you vulnerable? Can someone just brick your machine with no exploit, or can someone just write a backdoor into your BIOS? So it'll tell you vulnerability information, and you can dump the BIOS as well, and we have Python scripts to go do integrity checks. And then there's also a similar tool from Intel called ChipSec. You can go ahead and use that. It's not great for running on enterprise-wide, but it is good for just grab one of every machine in your enterprise, run it on those one machines, and then get a vulnerability check at least. And I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. You can read that later. So conclusion, basically at this point, all state-sponsored attackers, all states that execute what's the word, espionage. All state-sponsored attackers, everyone does it, right? So everyone knows that it's 100% feasible, 100% being done today, and now everybody wants to be like Mike. And so, we think that we're basically in a pretty dangerous world right now where, there's some threat actors who have demonstrated the capacity and will to, brick systems by wiping hard drives, right? So there's some people who like to wipe hard drives today. It would be really devastating and bad if they start bricking BIOSes. So just for your own awareness, right, we've got all of this papers and stuff you can go read, but just wanted you to understand that there's been sort of a massive spike in knowledge and awareness and releases of attacks in the past couple of years. And these are things that we've disclosed, other people like Intel have disclosed, but if you don't go out there and actually patch your BIOSes, then you're just leaving the door wide open for attackers. And just by way of anecdote, because people like statistics, right, we did an analysis on representative sampling of enterprise-grade machines. And basically, if these machines had never been patched, which some of them had, but we could go back in our historical data, if these machines had never been patched against all of these new flaws that are coming out, basically 99.95% of this enterprise, a couple of different enterprises actually, all of these machines, all vulnerable, right? And that's what you look like today, basically. So you're not patching, you're almost certainly 99.95% vulnerable. But the important thing is that there are things you can actually do about it, right? There are tools you can use to start enterprise-wide assessing your vulnerability situation and your integrity situation. So, please go out there and start paying attention to this and start doing something about it. So that's it for me. Don't have time for questions, but as always, go check out Open Security Training and go watch classes from Corey and I. Thank you. In the